Okay, so I am really, really honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today. What you see up there is this little badge right here. And it is a Leadership Gift Coach badge, and it's is one of the things I'm proudest of that I've earned, because that badge means that I've mentored, practiced under Christopher and the Leadership Gift Program, and devoted my life to responsible leadership. And we're going to talk about, or Christopher's going to talk about, responsible leadership and the practice of it during his talk this afternoon. So it's going to be a little bit different than what you've heard previously if you've heard Christopher speak. How many have heard Christopher speak? Oh, yeah. How many have not? Fantastic. So I think you're in for a treat. If you hear something great today and you want to explore it more, there's going to be a workshop later this year in the fall. It's at Cardinal Solutions, so thank you to Cardinal for helping co-sponsor it, as well as COHAA. We're also co-sponsoring it. And there'll be a 10% discount to our membership. So all of you here will have the ability to have a 10% discount to this workshop. It's a one-day immersion into what you're going to hear about today, a deep immersion. And then on the next day, there's a train-the-trainer session. So if you actually want to be able to train in the leadership gift and the responsibility process, there's the opportunity in day 2 to take part in that. Registration is not open yet. However, you can get on the wait list at that link, ChristopherAvery.com/W. If you want to pull out your phone and get there now while I go through the introduction, feel free. But it's a way for you to get on the wait list so that you're the first one to know when registration opens. Again, that's September 11th for the full-day workshop, and then the 12th is the Train the Trainer. All right, that's Christopher. He helps people in teams. And I'll just tell a little story about Christopher. So some of you might have heard this if you've heard me talk about Christopher before, but I met Christopher January of 2007. Doesn't seem that long ago, but that was 10 years. That was 10 years ago I met Christopher. And this meeting popped up on my calendar. I was in management at a company here in town, and we were starting our Agile transformation, and a meeting popped up on my calendar about some leadership training, right? How many of you have that happen? Right? Just some meeting comes on, and so I went. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know what to expect. I'm in management. I should go to leadership training because someone put it on my calendar. So I didn't think much about it until the end of the day, or 2 days, I think it was. And I'm not underestimating it when I say it was life-changing. I went there with zero expectation. I came out different. And it took me a while to actually join into the program. But I had a boss who worked on this material with me. I ended up joining his program about 4 or 5 years ago, so it took me a while. I kind of danced around it, kept in touch with Christopher, played with the responsibility process, and opted in a few years ago. And again, when I say it was life-changing, might be an understatement, because everything I learned there has helped me do what I wanted to do going forward in life. Helped me succeed where I wanted to succeed, helped me break through problems and barriers, greater than I ever could have without this. And there are a few folks in the audience who are also in the program who I consider friends and mentors and colleagues that we actually practice this stuff together, and it's actually a lot of fun and pretty cool. And very, very frustrating at times when you find yourself stuck. But today, Christopher is going to talk to us about the actual practice of responsibility. So some of the ways this can be applied. So I think you're going to find it really interesting. And if you want to know more about it, I'm here. I've got this little badge. You can come see me, talk to Christopher immediately after the talk, and check out the workshop for more information. So without further ado, brings me great pleasure to introduce my mentor, friend, and coach, Christopher Avery.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Hey, how are you? So I was going to ask what Joe asked. I think what I heard is most of you have not seen me anywhere talk about the responsibility process. Is that accurate? Is that what I saw? A lot of hands go up? Okay, cool. And what's really cool is that a lot of people keep coming back to see various lessons around this material over and over and over again because it's deep and it's powerful. So today I want to talk about leading yourself first. We're celebrating the launch of this book that was 10 years and finally getting it out. So we launched it at the regional Scrum gathering in Munich in October. So I'm happy that a few of you here got copies as well. So how many of you have things around yourself, your team, your family, your organization, or society that you'd like to change? Yeah. Anybody not? Anybody not? Okay, good. You're in the right room. So I want you to think more about the fact, more than that you want to change something, I want you to think specifically. Even write down, right now, I'd like you to write down a problem or two where you are eternally stuck. Right? So think about it or write down one or preferably two problems where you are really stuck in getting the results or making the change that you want to make. And then next to that, next to each one, I want you to write down what would have to change for you to get unstuck. What would have to change for that problem to go away? So I want this to be, as Joe said, about practicing responsibility. And the reason that Joe said that is because what I've learned most recently, and I've been promoting this material for a long time, what I've learned most recently is that in our work to publicize this, we have titillated tens of thousands of people all over the world with this inspiring model, the responsibility process. But of those tens of thousands, a scant few have actually developed a practice where they're practicing what we talk about by responsibility, which means that we haven't actually accomplished change by introducing the model and having people be cool about the content. We've only introduced change where the people have actually developed a practice. So I'd like to use my time today to see if we can start increasing that ratio by helping you develop a practice. Would that be okay if we got practical about this and not just inspiring about the content? So we can have some fun, but would it be also okay now and then if I got a little serious about this? Yes? No? Okay. So you've written down a couple of problems. You've written down a couple of things that have to change. Good. So now we have real context for each of you to apply what we're going to do here. So the responsibility process is this cool model that has fallen out of a phenomenological study. Phenomenological is a $5 word that means that we just observed human behavior over time. We observed phenomenon. In other words, we didn't start with any theory and we didn't start with any literature trying to prove it or disprove it. But I joined this research program where a couple of guys were teasing out a pattern in our minds whereby we process thoughts about taking and avoiding responsibility. And it turns out that we're really good at both, and we're hardwired for both. You and I are both hardwired for taking responsibility and for avoiding it. How many of you are surrounded with people that you would really like to step up and take a little more ownership? Any of you? Yeah, so there's the proof that we might be hardwired to avoid it. Now, how many of them are waiting for you to step up and take ownership according to what they think it should be? All right, yeah. And so we've teased out this pattern that is in my mind, and I'm bold enough to say it's in your mind, and I'm bold enough to say it's in the mind of everybody we know, about how human beings, all human beings, process thoughts about taking and avoiding responsibility. And it turns out that it's all about our perceptions of cause and effect. Now, if you were here this morning, Tim Ottinger mentioned fundamental attribution error and the idea of how we attribute cause and effect. And what was he talking about? The doppelganger? Is that what you were talking about? And about whether your doppelganger was accurate or not? So we're very active in attributing cause and effect. And as you can see, some of these words up here are kind of interesting about how we do that. I want to make sure that you have a good understanding of that today, and then I want to make sure that you know how to start practicing it. So this model, when I was introduced to it at first, met these two guys working on this, I already had a doctorate in organization science and leadership. I'd been through tons of sociology and psychology, and I looked at this model and they explained it briefly to me, and I realized I was staring at what I think is the most powerful model of normal psychology that I'd ever seen. And no wonder it's become very important to me and the center of my work. So it's taught me that you and I are far more powerful than we usually give ourselves credit for. That we like to take credit when things go well, but when things don't go well, we tend to, remember that little gif of the cat and the baby this morning in Tim's talk, right? And the baby turned around and blamed the cat, right? So you and I tend to do the same thing. When things don't go well, we tend to assign it to external circumstances. And what it's taught me is if I actually start to claim credit for my mistakes, for the things that don't go well, I learn much faster. So it's taught me I'm far more powerful and able than I usually give myself credit for. It's also taught me that leadership, therefore, is innate. In other words, this process in our mind, to me, proves that we are each leading ourselves to our current experience of our reality. And there's no other explanation for it, right? So, in other words, if you've been making your own choices for more than a few years, who is the architect of your experience? Right? And if you don't like your current experience, who gets to refactor it? Yeah, so I think the question about whether leaders are born or made is off the table. And the answer is we all have leadership within us. It's just whether you choose to tap into it and develop it or not. And it starts with leading yourself first. So that's where we're going here. I want to tell you a few stories of some of my heroes. These heroes are all people that I've worked with or supported. And I'll start with the first. Christoph Stendel is a young man in Austria who started his own software consulting firm and software development shop 11 years ago. Today they have, I think, over 200 people and doubling rapidly in 3 or 4 countries. They're involved in some pretty amazing things, including that Hyperloop system, the Tesla program. And he built his company culture and leadership based on 2 primary models, the responsibility process and the theory of constraints. His company, which is Catalysts, has won the best company to work for in Austria 4 out of the last 5 years. Not bad, pretty cool. The next person, Tammy Cole, she came to me because she wanted to be done working in her company, and she wanted to find a way to have the courage to change her life and to build or buy her own company and run it. She was working for one of the big consulting firms. You would recognize the letters in the name. And today, Tammy's the CEO of DocuStrats, a company in Connecticut that's all about employing women and others disadvantaged and serving amazing clients. And Tammy says that she would not have been able to do this without the practice of responsibility. So some stories of change and self-leadership here. Tom Hadashell was recruited by a little plastics manufacturing company to Kerrville, Texas, to turn around a failing plastics company. So it's a regular plastic molding shop with about 12 molding machines, and I think they had around 60 employees. And Tom met me early in his time there. I lived in a city nearby in Austin, actually in Comfort at the time. And over the course of 10 years, Tom used the responsibility process as his primary leadership tool, and again as a culture building tool to build a culture of responsibility, and turned the company around from being the worst employer in Kerrville, Texas, to being the best employer in Kerrville, Texas, and sold the company for his owners for 10 times earnings. Now, if you know about valuing companies, a kind of an average price to sell a company is at 3 times earnings. So if you get 10 times earnings, that means you're producing fabulous margins, and his margins were getting past 25% in a very low margin business, plastics molding. So Tom rang the bell at 40 years old, cashed out, made a lot of money in the ghost stock that he had in the company, spent about a year enjoying himself, and then bought another little plastics company in Dallas, Texas called All Plastics. You can look it up, allplastics.com. He's been growing that company with the same principles and same theories. The people that bought his company in Kerrville ran it into the ground, so their margins are back to very little. And Tom's about to buy that business back. Right? You see the smile on his face? That smile never leaves. Right? The people in his business don't like to go home from work because it's just such a cool place to hang out. Mary Leah McAnally was the former dean of MBA programs at one of the top business schools in the country, the Texas A&M Mays School of Business. And during her deanship, what she stood for was restoring capitalism's good name. And she was looking for an ethics focus to bring into their leadership program. And so Mary Leah McAnally is a client of mine. She's a member of the Leadership Gift Program, and the responsibility process is in the leadership curriculum at the Mays Business School at Texas A&M University. Pretty amazing. And then there's this woman, Jessica Siroki. Anybody know Jessica? Anybody know Jessica? I think she's in the room. Jessica, are you in the room? She's here. Raise your hand high. Right? I asked her if I could mention her name. Jessica and I met 5 years ago when I was doing an earlier version of that workshop that I'm going to come do in September. At that time, Jessica was introduced to me as a college student intern, but it looked like the job she was doing was driving this Agile coach around so that he could talk on his phone and work on his laptop in between appointments. So Jessica got introduced to this stuff and probably fell for it as hard as anybody I've ever seen, maybe even harder than I did. Got involved with me and with the program, and she was looking for a way to really confront, really face herself so that she would grow rapidly, and she decided to commit herself to writing a blog about her journey. It's a pretty amazing journey. There's over 100 blog posts now. Most of them are available at ChristopherAvery.com, and the rest are available at Blogspot. Look for Jessica Siroki. So if you do the math, 5 years later, she was a 19-year-old intern then. Today, Jessica is a director of Agile practices for a company in Indianapolis. She's a world-renowned speaker, right? And is doing a job that one of her reports, I understand, told her she shouldn't be doing because of her age, right? So I hope I give you a little example of the power of this material in terms of helping people change what they want to change as long as they're willing to practice it. So Jessica, thank you for your demonstration. Right. So let's go here. There's a huge difference between being a responsible person and taking 100% responsibility. Now, if you think that you're going to get a sermon about being a better person, you're not. my view on responsibility is that it's not about whether or not you're a good person. It's about how we learn and grow and how we use this pattern in our minds. So let's start with this premise. The premise is that everybody in this room is already a responsible person, according to society's standards. So what does that mean? What that means is that being responsible according to societal standards means that you're good, you stay in school, you get an education, you get a good job, you contribute to society. Right? How many of you have people on your right and left that look like they've met all of those criteria? Oh, come on. Look around. You're surrounded by people, you're surrounded by responsible people, according to society's measures, right? So we're good. We're also called responsible if we're doing what we're supposed to do, even if it makes us, right? Say, oh, look, he's being responsible, right? Now, taking responsibility is a little different. Taking responsibility or practicing 100% responsibility means owning your world, right? So some of the founders of the whole coaching movement, CTI, Coach Training Institute, and one of the co-founders, Henry Kimsey House, and his wife Karen Kimsey House have written a wonderful book called Coactive Leadership, and they define leaders as people who take responsibility for their world. Right? So taking responsibility means a commitment to self-leadership, and it also means realizing that you have the freedom to choose in every single moment, which is a little different than being responsible. Right? So it turns out that if you read the history of responsibility, and there's a chapter in the book where I kind of fly through recorded history, looking at philosophy and religion and psychology and other areas, and sample a little bit here and there from the writings about responsibility. It turns out that all the gurus who write pithy quotes about responsibility say that responsibility isn't about what happens to you. Responsibility is about how you what? Respond. Yeah, and they write quotes like, it's not how many times you get knocked down that's important, it's how many times you... Right. So I always thought those were pretty pithy quotes. And as I started studying responsibility, what I realized is that there's deep, 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 deep truth in that. And that is that the psychology of responsibility is all about how you and I respond when we have a problem, when we're challenged, when something goes wrong. Right? So for how many of you do things go wrong every day? For how many of you did 6 or 8 things go wrong by the time the conference started this morning? Yeah, I'm standing in line to sign up, and I hear people complaining about the traffic, about the coffee service at breakfast, about their boss trying to get them to not stay at the conference, go back home. Right? We have problems all day long. And what I'm going to suggest to you is every time something happens, this little pattern in our mind gets activated. Right? And it actually helps us process our thoughts about what we're going to do about that. Right? So the responsibility process gets triggered with a problem. Now, probably at this point, where's Tim? Tim Ottinger here? So Tim this morning asked you, he gave you 3 important principles, one of which was to celebrate mistakes, right? How fantastic! Remember that? Yeah. And then maybe turn judgment into curiosity. So these are actually advanced principles that suggest, well, maybe if we can look at things happening and not see them as a problem, maybe it won't generate this pattern in our minds, this responsibility process. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I want to connect for you the practice of what I'm talking about. So it turns out that the psychology of responsibility has to do with what you and I do and everybody we know does when something goes wrong, big or small. And we now know that things go wrong all day, every day. And by the way, what do we have all those emergency meetings about at work? All those emergency meetings are about a what? Problem. So now if you get this responsibility process pattern, now you have a bunch of people in the meeting all with this thing triggered in our minds, right? And you can start seeing how we can waste a tremendous amount of time not getting anything done because of our various perceptions of cause and effect for why we have that problem. All right, so we enter the pattern with a problem. And you may or may not like this, but the research suggests, not only suggests, it's pretty serious. The research says that your and my first response when something goes wrong is to do what that little crawling baby did this morning, and that is take that finger and point it at some entity that we're sure did this to us, right? Tim, I need a copy of that GIF with the cat and the baby. I need that, right? So that is the essence of lay blame, that little baby turning around and pointing her finger at the cat that tripped her up. It doesn't sound very mature of us, and it doesn't sound terribly responsible of us, but our research suggests that it's what we do. It seems to be that we're hardwired. And even if we don't actually blurt it out and do it, it's our first thought when something goes wrong. So I'll give you an example. I'm working away in my office. I've got a couple more things to do before leaving for an appointment. I dig into those things. I finally look up at the clock and say, oh my goodness, I'm going to be late. So I have a little anxiety, this idea of something wrong, right? And I reach for that place. I always keep my keys and they're not there. And my first thought is, who took my keys? They were right here, right? So tell me if you haven't done that recently. Right? How many of you live with somebody else? A partner, a spouse, family, roommates, right? Have you ever recently walked through your house saying, honey, have you seen my phone, laptop, briefcase, purse, keys, something else? And it has this little lilt of guilt, right? Establishing accusation in the voice like they did something with it, right? And if you're in my house, the answer comes back, yes, Christopher, it's right on the counter where you set it down yesterday when you came in, right? So if you start watching for this, what you'll see is good, well-intended people. When something goes wrong, our first reaction is to deflect or defend. In other words, we have a mental state where the logic is that we're in the position of effect. We have a problem, and it upsets us a little bit or a lot. And the cause of the problem is where? Right? The cause of the problem is outside of us. If we accept the answer that our mind gives us in this state of blame, so this is a mental state. Think of it that way, or think of it as a little island in our mind where we get sent when we have some anxiousness or some upset or something goes wrong, when we get blocked from a goal. If we like the answer that our mind hands us, then we use our faculties to prove it, or to do our best to prove it, which means for me to be happy, that thing is going to have to change, right? Because we've identified the fact that we're at effect and the cause is out there, so for our effect to change, what has to change? That entity has to change. Yeah. Now, here's the interesting thing. It's just a mental state. It's just a mental state. What did I say? It's just a what? It's just a mental state. And what's interesting about this mental state is it has its own logic. And it's the only logic available in that mental state. And it's a logic of cause and effect. And it's the only way to see the world, and when you're there, you're sure you're right. Now, here's what's cool about it being a mental state, is you can stay stuck in it, and you can stay stuck in it for a second or a minute or a day, month, year, decade, lifetime, or you can get off of it, you can let it go. So let's do the test of being stuck there. This is a serious moment, and I want you to do it with a bit of compassion and empathy. How many of you know someone dear to you probably, who is stuck in blame around some long-standing problem in their life, and they're doing their best to cope with it, and you know they'd be better off if they gave that up, right? If they got off of that, but they can't see that. How many of you know somebody like that? Yeah, most of us do, right? So I only ask you that as a proof point that it's just a mental state. And when we're in it, it owns us. And we can also get off of it. When we get off of blame, we land in the next mental state we've identified, which is called justify. And justify is very much like blame, in which the logic of justify is, again, I'm at effect and cause is out there. But now it's a little bit more complex than blame. Blame is a very specific entity. It's a person, usually someone in your favorites list, or at least in your contacts list. It's usually, we blame the people closest to us, right? Or maybe the entities that we're close to, like our employers, right? Or our departments or managers. In justify, we've gotten off of a specific entity, and now instead of an entity, it's a situation, a set of circumstances, a set of conditions, right? And these set of conditions are always beyond our what? Control, right? So, I'm reaching for my keys. They're not there. I say, who took my keys? I start a search in my mind for who's come into my office and taken my keys since I came to work, and the answer is nobody's been in my office since I came to work. And yes, I did drive today. And that actually knocks me off of the mental state of lay blame. And do you know what my very next thought is? My very next thought is a story, a wonderful story about how busy I was when I came to work and I had a million things on my mind, right? And I was solving a problem on my phone, on my cell phone, and when I'm opening the door, the desk phone's ringing, and as I get the door open farther, there's a mess in the office. It looks like a burglar had come in and stirred things up, but no, there was a storm last night, and a branch came through the window, and it broke the window, and rain and wind came up and made a mess, and some animal came through the window and did something right there in the potted plant. And certainly anybody in this situation could have forgotten where they put their keys, couldn't they? Couldn't they? Couldn't they? Yes. See, we're also really good at selling these things to each other, right? You're sitting, some of you are saying, poor baby, yes, I get your story, right? So justify is when we've got some anxiousness. Remember, I'm still late to go see somebody, and I've got to find my keys, and here I am telling myself a story about a set of circumstances beyond my control. So justify is a really interesting mental state for us, and we spend a ton of time in justify around problems that we think that we can't do anything about, and we're also taught to only do things, deal with things where we can actually control. So it's easy for us to justify. But again, it's just a mental state. And in the mental state, we stay stuck. And in the mental state, we talk about our problem, and we talk about the set of circumstances, and we talk about it over and 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 over, but we never actually do anything about the problem. We just talk about it. So simple justifies, weather, traffic, things like that. The single most powerful justify that I deal with in my consulting work with clients, guess what it is? That's just the way it is around here. And then the expanded version, that's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always going to be. And then we stick our assumption on the end of it, which is there's nothing we can do about it. Which means you get to keep the problem. So what's cool about the lesson of the responsibility process is it shows us These mental states that we're in where we talk, which is how we cope with this anxiety of having this problem, but the more we talk about it, the farther away we are from actually doing anything about it because we're not taking ownership of it. So in Justify, I'm going to use all of my resources to prove that there's nothing I can do because the circumstances are beyond my control. We can stay in Justify for a second, a minute, an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, a lifetime, or because it's just a mental state, it's just an island in our mind with its own cause and effect, we can, do you remember the phrase? We can get off of it. It's just a mental state. If we get off of Justify, we graduate to another fairly pernicious mental state called shame, right? Often experienced as guilt. And it seems that what happens here is that the sorting mechanism in our mind that's doing this work on cause and effect says, well, let me see, we rejected blame, external blame. We rejected external story or situation. Let's flip that external variable to what? To internal. Oh, you're the dummy. You're the dolt. You did this, right? So shame or guilt is the self-talk that we have when we have a problem or a mistake and, or anxiety about situation, about life, and we decide to quit blaming on another person, we decide to quit telling a story about it or justifying, then the next thing that happens is we start feeling bad about having this. And the reason it's in a different color here because society has taught you that you probably shouldn't blame and justify. All right, let me get another show of hands. How many of you have been raised being told that you should not blame other people and you should not make excuses and tell stories? Anybody? Right, and how many of you are telling your kids that too? Yes? Awesome. So we're in alignment with society for these red words, red phrases. But here's where we start differing this research from what society says. Society rewards you for beating yourself up. Right? Society says, oh, good boy or good girl, she's taking what? Responsibility. Yeah, so responsibility is another word for self-blame or for shaming oneself. And what I know is that there's a couple of reasons that that's not responsibility. What I know is that in the mental state of responsibility, I know that we feel free, powerful, and at choice. We feel like we're an agent in moving our lives and ourselves forward. We know that we have options. We know that we have choices. And we have lots of good choices when we're in the mental state of responsibility. In the mental state of shame, we feel very different. In the mental state of shame, our primary focus is on what's wrong with me. Right? That's our primary focus. What's wrong with me? And our self-talk is really amazing. Right? I'm so stupid. I'm such a bonehead. Geez, when will I ever learn? And we even think we deserve to have this problem because we tried something. We took a risk. Say, I guess I deserve this. I should have never stuck my neck out. Right? And we go through all this self-loathing and self-talk in this mental state. And our society thinks that shame is the sole domain of women. And what I've learned is that men experience it exactly the same way. It's just less taboo, or it's more taboo for us to talk about it than it is for women. And we also have a dynamic in our relationships in Western societies where women tend to more vocally take on more shame and guilt for stuff, and men love to shovel it to them. But when it comes to truly dealing with our own angst and with our own frustration about not having what we want, we experience it the same way, men and women. And we experience it deeply, and we're really good at it. Right? So if I were to ask you, how many of you know this self-talk, and you didn't raise your hand, my answer would be, come on, raise your hand. I've done the research. I know the answer. It's hardwired into us. It's our response. It's our response to problems and anxiety when we don't know how to rapidly learn or rapidly get over it. I'll give you one practice tool right now. If you catch yourself beating yourself up for having a problem or feeling bad or feeling guilty, stop asking the question, what's wrong with me? So I've noticed that in our society, we really teach each other to ask the question, what's wrong with me? Even worse, we say, what's wrong with you? But here's what we know that happens. You have this amazing processor up here on top of your neck, and if you ask it the question, what's wrong with me, it will answer. And it will help you create a long list, right? So I was born in the wrong family. I was born into the wrong neighborhood, right? I went to the wrong school system. You know where this is going, right? I studied the wrong thing in college. I took the wrong first job at the wrong company. I had the wrong first manager. Oh, and what about this hair and these genes that I was given, right? And on and on and on and on and on. So here's what I've learned is if you experience this self-talk of shame, if you find yourself in this island of shame where you're beating yourself up not only for being at effect of a problem, but also being the cause of it, if you're doing that, there's nothing wrong with you. So we don't blame because we're right or wrong, and we don't justify because we're right or wrong. We blame and justify because we're human and it's wired into us, which is one of the most compassionate things I've learned about this research and the responsibility process is we treat blame and justify as if people are morally bad or wrong for doing it. They're not bad or wrong. They're processing their thoughts about not having what they want. And it's how they're wired to process their thoughts. And oh, by the way, it's also been conditioned by society. So if you're experiencing shame, the truth is there's nothing wrong with you. You're human. Right? And a better answer than what's wrong with me is, what do I want? Right? What do I want? And it's interesting when we ask the question, oh, look at this mess I'm in, what do I want about this? Our mind actually helps us get to the mental state of responsibility where we're much more powerful, much more creative, much more free. It helps us get off of shame. Now, if we get off of this little mental island of shame, then the next place we land is called obligation. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little tired of this sequence because all of these ways are ways of not taking responsibility. And it seems like I'd rather have one way in which we're not taking responsibility and 6 ways in which we are. But this seems to be the way that we're wired. And it's how we're wired to cope with crap when we don't know how to learn immediately and to get the answer. But the mental state of obligation, I think you'll recognize this. The mental state of obligation is also a pseudo-responsibility. This is what society calls being a responsible person. In the mental state of obligation, we feel trapped. We feel completely and totally trapped in a promise, in a commitment, in a flow, in a pattern. And this is probably one of the most important purposes of what I'm doing. And I'm just going to read you the opening paragraph of the introduction of my book. Everywhere I turn, I see good, smart, and ambitious professionals who feel trapped in lives and jobs they don't want and who think they can't change. They feel powerless. They assume this is as good as it gets. These are good and generally responsible people. They are being responsible as defined by societal standards, but that doesn't mean they are taking responsibility as we now know it's possible for anyone to do. Obligation is a multi-trillion-dollar drag on our economy worldwide, the mental state of obligation. It's the mental state of have to, don't want to. Have to, don't want to. Right? Have to, don't want to. Right? What's your emotional state when you're trapped in a pattern or a flow or a commitment or a promise and you're in this mental state of obligation that you have to do something you don't want to do. You have to be or act like you're somebody that you don't want to be, or you have to put up with having something that you don't want to have. What's that emotional state? It's real powerlessness. Right? And so if you wonder if you have any of this, I can ask you some questions. How many of you have some really stupid meeting, hopefully not this one, that you have to go to? Have to. Stupid, boring, horrible, valueless meeting. The only reason I go is because I what? Yeah. Right. How many of you have some stupid paperwork you have to do on a regular basis? Horrible. Right. Yeah. How many of you have to go to your kids' events after school and you say to your buddies, oh, I'd really like to join you for a cold frosty beverage, but I have this kid thing I have to do? Right? Yeah. Instead of just, oh, I'm committed to be with my kids this evening. Here's one that might get you. How many of you have to go to your in-laws for holiday? Have to. How many times a day do you estimate, Ryan? How many times a day can we count that we say have to? Wow. Have to. I'm no longer in charge of my life. I made some decisions in the past that I thought were good decisions at the time. It turns out they come along with all this sequelae that I wasn't really expecting. And so now I'm no longer in charge of my life. I just do what I have to do instead of what? What I want to do. Yeah. So in other words, the language of have to is the language of I'm powerless. Right? That's the language of have to. So if you'd like to start changing that, I'll give you a little exercise that you can start practicing, and it's a very simple exercise. And I'll introduce you to the principles behind this exercise in a few minutes, but as long as we're at obligation, let me introduce you to the exercise. Here's the exercise. Catch yourself saying have to and stop. If it's already out, stop. And I'm going to give you some language to change it to. If you haven't said it yet, stop and reconstruct what you're about to say. And I want you to change it to this, some form of I get to. Right? I get to go to this stupid meeting. Now you laugh, and the reason is it's exactly that dissonance that I want you to feel. I want you to feel that dissonance because you're reminding yourself that there's no shackles on your legs, and the only one that's actually making you go to that stupid meeting is who? You. And I want you to admit that it's a choice. And admit to yourself, I am going to this stupid meeting because I haven't figured out how to change it or get out of it, but I'm working on it. Right? Now, here's what we've learned about this. If you sell out to the mental state of obligation, your mind doesn't start working on a new answer. Your mind says, yep, you're screwed. But if you actually call out your obligation, if you actually say, yep, I am going to this dumb meeting, I'm committed to this dumb meeting until I figure out how to change it, alter it, or get out of it, or do something more valuable, then this thing up here starts helping you solve the problem. It actually taps on the door of the responsibility mindset and says, open up, let me in, help me start solving this problem or this issue. So what's interesting is the mental state of responsibility is what I call the mental state of freedom, choice, and power. And it's right next to the mental state of being totally trapped, screwed and burdened. And it's not until we actually refuse to blame that we graduate to justify, and it's not until we refuse to justify that we graduate to shame. It's not until we refuse to beat ourselves up that we graduate to obligation, and it's not until we refuse to be trapped that we graduate to responsibility. So if you were asking me, how do I take responsibility, I would say, catch yourself blaming and stop. Catch yourself justifying and stop. Catch yourself beating yourself up and stop. catch yourself feeling trapped and stop. And then the cause-effect logic in each one of those mental states starts melting away, and you actually start accessing, I would say, more complex pathways in your mind that do much more probabilistic and stochastic reasoning, which is why it feels so great to be in this mental state. If you think about it, the cause-effect logic in these states below the line are so simplistic and mechanistic, and from my perspective and your perspective now too, it probably looks stupid, except we all get stuck in all of them, and we're all really good at using them to cope with problems instead of solve problems. So the practice of responsibility is not easy. The model is simple, and the model is very powerful. The practice is the challenging part. There's a couple of other positions that I'm not going to talk about now. I'm going to leave you to do a little research on your own. One thing you can do is at my website, you can download a copy of this poster that you can print and put on the wall, and on the back of it has all the teaching points, has the definitions of each of these mental states, and so you can learn much more. Also, if you I've been at this a long time, so if you just do a search on the internet for my name and the word responsibility, you'll fill up lots of pages with things that you can look at. But here's the issue in terms of agility and in terms of productivity and performance, and especially in terms of smart, ambitious people. And that is that no growth occurs when we're coping with problems. Right? Below the line, we talk about problems. Above the line, we do something about them. And this is the tragedy of the fact that we're so good at engaging in blame and justifying shame and obligation. Let me do a quick check here. How many of you have been involved in multi-million dollar meetings that go on for months, where most of the content of the meeting is blame and justify between parties around this problem? How many of you have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars doing that? Yeah, so what if we had a language and a way of recognizing this for each other, and a way to figure out how to get off of these mental states and move on? Now, you'd think that smart people like you and me and well-educated people, that we would rise past this. And what I've learned is actually the smarter we are and the more educated we are, the better we are at making up these stories. Right? So no one gets to escape this. And it doesn't get outgrown by title or authority or education or age. So I mentioned practice. So you know there's an old joke that formed on the streets of New York City where people were asking, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, practice, practice. Well, let's move into how do you develop a responsibility practice. Would that be worth spending a little time on? All right. I had a note to myself here. Let me see if this is where I made it. Not yet. All right. So most people, when they're introduced to the responsibility process, they start first checking whether they think they have one of these running in their own mind. And so I want you to do that verification for yourself. This is an experiment with an N of 1. Right? I've shown you what I know about the research. Now I want to check with you. How many of you think that maybe this model is valid, that you might have one of these running in your mind? How many of you think that might be true? Maybe? Some of you? How many of you are sure the people around you have one of these running? Right. Okay, that's the real check. Right. So most people, when they realize that, then they start asking, well, what do I do about it? So I want to introduce you to the interface. So the responsibility process is kind of the hidden, unconscious or subconscious pattern in our minds that we don't even know is running until we start studying this and become more aware of this. But now I can introduce you to the capabilities that you already have that you can employ to work with this pattern. And so there's 3 keys to responsibility. And these are the 3 keys to understanding it, to unlocking the responsibility process, and to practicing it. And the first key is intention. And intention can be a huge study of the mind. If you look, there's been a ton of stuff done over the last 20 or 30 years about living intentionally and having intentional values and principles, right? And intention also means the idea of free will and volition. All right, Tim mentioned volition this morning. Volition as in voluntary, as in not feeling trapped, as in being able to choose your direction, your path, what's next. So it turns out that there's a very specific intention that we can practice in order to practice responsibility, and that's simply the intention to operate from responsibility when things go wrong. So if you want to begin this practice today, however you create your basic commitments to yourself, your prime directives or your directives close to prime, create one that says, I want to get to the top of that responsibility process model around every upset, every frustration, every obstacle in my life, because that's the only place where I can free myself from the frustration. Right? And here's the reason, is that the idea of a problem is that it's you being in motion towards what you want, and something stops you, and at that moment you have a conflict in your mind that's like a force field. And so even though we think the problem is out there, where is the definition of the problem? Yeah, the definition of the problem is here. And the definition of the problem is causing you angst, which is these two opposing ideas that you're holding in your mind. So that's the source of your anxiety or angst or frustration. And the only way for you to release that, right, is to figure out how to take ownership of that. So I'm not asking you to pile everything in the world on your plate. What I'm saying is that the practice of responsibility is figuring out how to own your own interpretation, own your own filters, own your own beliefs, own your own assumptions about that, so that you can get to the place where you can do something about it, because the real problem isn't out there, the real problem is in here because of this psychology going on in the mind. The second key to responsibility is awareness. And the awareness key, again, huge study of consciousness, mindfulness, presence, being in the now, right? Huge study of the mind, this idea of awareness. But the way you can start practicing awareness today is simply vow to become more and more aware of what it's like to be you when you're blaming, when you're justifying, when you're beating yourself up, when you're in obligation. What are the words you use? What are the phrases you use? What are the out theres that you're pointing to, that you're blaming or that you're justifying? And the way that this is important, remember what I said, is if you refuse to blame, then you graduate to what? Justify. And if you refuse to justify, you graduate to, and if you refuse to shame, you graduate to obligation. If you refuse to feel trapped, you graduate to responsibility, which is where you realize that you're totally free, powerful in that choice. You're the architect of your reality. If you don't like it, you're the only one who can change it, and you do get to change it. Right? So awareness, in our case, is a very specific awareness that you can start practicing. So I ask you to write down two problems. I ask you to write down what would have to change for these problems to go away, for these problems to change. Let me ask you a question. How many of you decided that now there's a different answer to that what would have to change than the one you wrote down? Anybody? No? Yes? Some? Is anybody more aware of the nature of that problem now than you were when you wrote it down? Okay, there I see more heads shaking. Yeah, so hopefully we've already practiced responsibility a little bit. The important thing here is that what I've noticed when it comes to our teams and our cultures is that in environments of justify and blame, those very toxic, high-drama environments, we get no results, right? So we spend weeks and months spending millions of dollars of the company's money in meetings, pointing fingers at each other, and telling stories about why we can't solve the problem. When we operate from shame and obligation, It causes a little bit of angst and gets us into motion, right? So think about this. Bosses ask me the question, they say, Christopher, what's wrong with obligation? Isn't that how we design work? We hire people and then we hold them. Right? Yeah. And what I tell them is, well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with obligation. I've experienced it for much of my life, and I know there's nothing wrong with me. I'm a human being. So there's nothing wrong with it as a mental state. We all experience it plenty. But in terms of performance, what I know about it is that it comes along with two huge costs. One is that our performance in this mental state is barely adequate to get a pass, because our motivation is survival. Our motivation is not purpose. And so if you look at the environments you know where people are only there out of obligation because they have to be, you can see that this motivation is barely adequate to get a pass. I have a wonderful story about making my son go mow the lawn once, right? And I used to carry pictures around about what the lawn looked like after he mowed it, because he mowed it in a state of obligation, right? Was there anything wrong with my son? No. It was the mental state he was operating in at the moment. So I said there's two things about obligation. The first is our level of performance. The second is we're building up this virus in our mind called resentment. And our resentment is towards whatever it is that we think has us trapped. The mortgage, the bank, the spouse, the needy elderly parents, the kids, whatever. When, as I said earlier, right, if you're trapped and you've been making your own decisions for a while, you're probably the architect of that. So it turns out that we get unsatisfying results when we operate out of shame and obligation, and when your teams do. But when we operate out of responsibility, we get results that truly matter, which is why there's an awful lot of fans of this as a practice for leadership around. So I want to offer you a new guide that's available, and it's hidden, so I have to actually tell you where to go find it. But I've got a guide for a resource guide for the top 10 tools that I've found over the years for mastering responsibility. And if you'd like it, get out your smartphone and open a browser. And you want to take yourself to the.leadershipgift.com. the.leadershipgift.com. And when you get there, it's a long info page about the Leadership Gift program. I want you to scroll all the way to the bottom of the page. So the.leadershipgift.com. Scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, and there's this big letters saying not ready to join, and get the resource guide. So it's a 2-page PDF, tiny little thing. This isn't a huge thing for you to read, but it's the top 10 resources I've found for mastering responsibility that will help you start building a practice. Most of them are free, and 2 cost under $20. Great. So the third key to responsibility is confront. Now, confront sounds like a negative word, like being confrontational. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean to get in somebody else's face and tell them they're not taking responsibility. What it means is it's a bold word that means the ability to face. Now, it turns out that the reason that many of us cope with problems forever is because we really don't have the courage to face our own fears, to face our own anxiety, or we don't know how to do it. And so what confront means is to actually be willing to face our angst or our frustration and look in the mirror and start asking ourselves 20 questions about our own beliefs, about our own assumptions, about our own premises of cause and effect. And when we do that, it actually starts moving us to this mental state of responsibility. So it's very much like the tool that I gave you. Catch yourself saying have to and change it to get to. That's a practice of confront. So you have an intention to take responsibility, you're aware of catching yourself saying have to, and you're actually willing to confront it by saying, I am going to this stupid meeting even though there's no shackles on my feet. So those are the 3 keys, and I spend all of my time helping individuals, leaders, coaches, and their teams figure out how to build their responsibility practice by using these 3 keys over and over and over. And they're all mental abilities that you were born with and that you can develop like any muscle. So I already said that. So I'm really sorry that I didn't say this before some of the people have already left the room. I'm afraid some of them have gone to the phones to call the person they love and say, honey, I now know what's wrong with you. So please don't do that. And if you've already texted that, quick, take it back. But what we've learned is the responsibility process only works when self-applied, because you can only recognize blame in yourself and choose to get off of it. If you use this as a weapon and throw it at somebody else and say you're in blame or you're in justify, right, then that person did have one problem for which they're coping and trying to figure out what to do about it, and now they have a second problem. And guess which problem's bigger? Yeah, the second problem, you in their face, labeling them. Right? So this only works when self-applied, which means it's a horrible management tool. I have actually had experiences where people heard this pitch, they read a little bit about it, and then they went back to their company as a CEO and wrote a policy and sent an email out, said, from now on, we're all going to operate from responsibility. I had to call them up and say, how do you think that's going to work? Especially if this is a very natural process that kicks in every time something goes wrong. And I think a lot of people just read an email and had this process kick in. Right? So it's a horrible management tool. It's a great self-leadership tool. It's a powerful leadership tool. And so let me show you some practices. I want to quickly show you some models that we've built as a result of practicing intention, awareness, and confront around problems. My first career and my first book was about teamwork. I wrote a book called Teamwork as an Individual Skill. And this model of the responsibility process was in a very nascent stage in that book, but I was looking for a way to understand shared responsibility, and it's why I found this research team, and it's why I found this model of the responsibility process. And what we did was we simply started looking at what are the major frustrations, what are the major headaches, what are the major sources of heartburn that people have trying to build teams, and how can we, as a leader or even as a peer, take ownership of these things and do something about it. And out of this emerged the team orientation process, which is a very simple model that you can carry around with you and use to build any team, anytime. And the reason is it puts you in a place of taking ownership for making sure that you are on a great team. How many of you would like to be assured that you are on a really fantastic team? Yeah. So are you willing to take 100% responsibility for making that happen? Right? Because there's only one person who can, right? Because the average curve of teams says that most teams suck. Actually, most teams are middling, and as many suck as are high performance. And if you want to change that, it's up to somebody to take responsibility for that. And if you're the one that knows how, then that's good for you. In the book, I devote a whole chapter to the Catch Sooner game. The Catch Sooner game is a game that we've found that we can use to change any habit or behavior. How many of you have some bad habits you don't like of yourself? This game works to change habits. And the game is very simple. It starts by saying, upper right, starts by saying, catch yourself engaging in that activity that you no longer want to do. And then stop and change at that moment. So let's say I want to stop eating donuts, and I wake up and I'm 2 bites into a donut. Now, the somewhat impractical thing that we often do is say, oh, well, I've eaten this much of it, I might as well finish, right? This model says, be brave enough to catch yourself and change. So I walk over to the wastebasket and drop it in. Then, forgive yourself. Now, we're different than almost every self-accountability model on the planet that says when you fall short of expectations of yourself, punish yourself, pay a fine, have a jar that you have to put $5 into, do extra push-ups, right? Deprive yourself of something. Well, where is that on a responsibility process model? That's shame, right? What we've learned is if instead of punishing ourselves for falling short of what we want to change, what if we forgive ourselves for being human, for being someone that developed this habit over 40, 45, 50 years that must have served us pretty well? How can we expect it to change just like that, right? This is a pretty deep rut that I've built here. So when we forgive ourselves, it actually moves us to the mental state of responsibility as a place of freedom. And what we've found is that we can change much more rapidly there. So after forgiving oneself or having some self-compassion, the next step is to vow to catch ourselves sooner the next time. So the next time I catch myself after having one bite, or I catch myself going for the table, or I catch myself from across the room looking at them. Right? I've changed a lot of behaviors this way, a lot of habits. I've quit smoking. I've changed a lot of leadership habits this way. And a lot of people have learned to practice responsibility using this around catching themselves blaming and changing, catching themselves justifying and changing, catching themselves beating themselves up and changing. This is going to be the subject of my talk at Agile 2017 in August. We've also developed a model around good goals. This is the work of one of my teammates and actually my mentor, a guy named Bill McCarley. And he took a look at goals, and what he found is that most of our goals are likely out of obligation. And the reason that we have problem achieving goals and the reason that we think that we're a procrastinator is because our goals aren't really very good. And so what are the characteristics of good goals? The characteristics of good goals is that they clarify our intention, they focus our awareness or attention, right? They remove obligation. So if I were going to do a workshop with you on good goals, I'd have you write down all your goals and I'd have you identify how many of them are only goals out of obligation, right? And what can we do about that? And good goals generate energy. And finally, we have a model that's a culture-building bridge from responsibility to accountability that's used in many of these client organizations where they have cultures of responsibility. And that is before you call somebody else out, before you hold somebody else to account, we simply want you to go through a thought exercise that says, am I operating from responsibility? Because about 95% of holding other people to account sounds like blame to me. Right? So where am I in the responsibility process? And have an honest assessment for yourself. And then ask yourself, do you know what you want? Do you know how often we yell at other people without knowing what we really want? We're just angry, and the way for that anger to come out is to send it to somebody. So have you done the work to know what you really, really want? And then have you asked for what you want? How often have you been upset with somebody else that had no idea of what your expectations were? And then do you have agreement? And if those are all done and in place, then you can have a conversation about calling to account. But what we've found is that responsibility is greater than accountability. In other words, when we have an environment of responsibility, then accountability just happens easily. And when we put accountability or holding others to account above our own sense of ownership for the situation, then we tend to create more fear in the environment and more of a toxic environment. So thank you. I think I'm really at the end of my time, but I think that also means that I can probably take a few questions if you like. So are there questions? Who has a question? No? All right, well, cool. I'll be around for, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes, and happy to talk to you if you like. Thank you very much.